Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971. 20 years later, his top aide admitted it was never about drugs. It was about you, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, the architect of the DEA. In 1994, he confessed everything to Harper's Magazine. His exact words: "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Follow now, because this is the part they buried for decades. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. The DEA launched in 1973. Prisoners, 200,000 then. 2.3 million now. Most locked up for nonviolent drug offenses. Your friends who got arrested for a joint in '72? That wasn't about drugs. Your black neighbors swept up in raids? That wasn't about safety. It was about silencing opposition to Vietnam. It was about stopping the civil rights movement. Ehrlichman died in 1999, never prosecuted. The DEA still exists. Nixon didn't declare war on drugs. He declared war on you. And 5 presidents later, the war still isn't over.
Yeah! We are back, and we are black. Here on WLTH 1370 AM, that is 92.7 on the 92.7 in the FM dial. If you're nasty, Janet, where did you go? Where did you go, Janet? Where did they take you away from me? Oh Lord, we are back. It is 6:50 in the PM here on a Friday, February the 27th, 2026. The future is here. The future is now. Yes. And as you heard in the intro, a lot of our future, where we're going, has been set by a lot of policies from the past. And there are very few policies that have had the impact on this country that the war on drugs had. The war on drugs was started in 1971 by Richard Nixon. As you hear in the video, he started it, according to his own aides, people who were around him, to disrupt black communities and the hippies, the anti-war left. He did not like the anti-war left, and he didn't like black people. And so his goal was to disrupt those communities, and he could use drugs as a pretense for a police state in those communities, much like Donald Trump is using the pretense of immigration for a police state. And so that is what we are living with currently. And I think 55 years on, I think it's important to ask the question, should we legalize drugs? Should we? Like, I'm just saying, folks, we should certainly look at the effect that the war on drugs has had on our community, and our country. And look, as I said at the beginning of the show, in the war on drugs, there is no denying that the winner of the war on drugs has been drugs. Drugs has been the winner on war on drugs. There are more people on drugs today than at any time in American history, 55 years after our country declared war on them. Imagine declaring war on poverty, and then there's more poor people after the war than there were before. You'd call it a crappy war, wouldn't you? I think you would. And so I think it's important to just keep an open mind when we talk about drug liberalization Drug liberalization is the process of decriminalizing, legalizing, or repealing laws that prohibit the production, possession, sale, or use of prohibited drugs. Variations of drug liberalization include drug legalization, drug re-legalization, and drug decriminalization. A lot of us who support drug liberalization may favor a regulatory regime for the production, marketing, and distribution of some or currently illegal drugs in a manner analogous to that of alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco. It's important to understand that between 1919 and 1933, alcohol was illegal in this country. A lot of people don't know that. It was called prohibition. And you know what we got out of prohibition? Al Capone. Al Capone. The mafia. Gangsters made billions of dollars selling illegal alcohol to the public. And you saw some of the most violent periods in this country's history during Prohibition. But by 1933, the public was sick and tired of watching the level of violence and danger that went on with the war on alcohol, so we ended it. Meanwhile, we started the war on drugs in 1971, proceeded to have the most violent period maybe ever in this country's history, at least since colonial times, at least since the Civil War maybe. The 70s, the 80s, the 90s were the most violent decades in modern history. In 70s, we had heroin. In the 80s, we had crack. In 90s, you start seeing sort of a bifurcation into things like crystal meth and MDMA and other drugs. But the result is ultimately the same. There's less people using drugs today than were using them in 1971. We had the most drug overdoses in American history within the last 5 years. And so I think it's important. It's time to start looking at this. The legalization of drugs would eradicate the illegal drug market, which, like I said, during Prohibition gave you people like Al Capone, Murder Inc., Lucky Luciano, and those types of people. In the modern day, the Bloods and the Crips, the Vice Lords, the Gangster Disciples, all, La M, Mexican Mafia, MS-13, all of the Mexican cartels. We all talk about the Mexican cartels. They are out and out just fed by America's war on drugs. The prohibition of recreational drugs like weed, which is cannabis, opiates, cocaine, amphetamines, and hallucinogens have been completely ineffective. It has been completely counterproductive. And the way a lot of countries respond to this is by implementing practices for harm reduction and increasing the availability of addiction treatment. And it's also important to state that before the 20th century, drugs were basically legal in America. Like, we used to put cocaine in Coca-Cola. The founding fathers started the country with the idea that whatever you did was your own business as long as you weren't hurting anybody else. So you can see cocaine and opiates and all kinds of stuff back then. Now you started to have, post the Civil War, you started to have certain cities and certain states and certain communities banning certain things. But overall, there was no overreaching illegality to using drugs up until the early 20th century. Opium was used by people in the Revolutionary War. A lot of the people who won our independence from the British were using the equivalent of heroin and OxyContin and oxycodone, which is heroin in time-release capsules. Cocaine use was very prominent in the 18th and 19th centuries. One of the reasons that we have the views on drugs that we have now is because we had a drug czar named Harry Anslinger, who was very racist, who perpetuated the ideas that marijuana would make white women run away with Mexicans and with Negro jazz musicians. That's literally how they sold drug prohibition in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s. They also said that cocaine would make black men impervious to bullets, so that when black men were rampaging through communities and raping and killing and doing all these horrible things, the police wouldn't be able to stop them because they were hopped up on cocaine. The term war on drugs was popularized in the media by Richard Nixon, as we talked about in 1971, with the goal of disrupting black and hippie communities. Not to make anybody safer, because it didn't. It didn't make anybody safer. I can't reiterate this enough, because a lot of y'all is what the young people call the old heads. I got to reiterate this. You guys do know that the 70s, 80s, and 90s were the most violent decades in modern history, right? All after the war on drugs. Chicago, everybody talks about Chicago. Chicago's most violent year was 1974. They killed almost 1,000 people in 1 year in Chicago. 1974. And in the early 90s, they had another peak in violent crime where they killed over 900 people in 1 year. The war on drugs did absolutely nothing to stem the tide of the violence and actually fed a lot of the violence in places like Chicago. In June of 2011, the Global Commission on Drug Policy released a critical report declaring the global war on drugs has failed with devastating consequences for individuals and societies around the world. In 2023, just 3 years ago, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stated that decades of punitive war on drug strategies had failed to prevent an increasing range and quantity of substances being produced and consumed. That year, the annual U.S. federal drug war budget reached $39 billion. Let me say it again, $39 billion. Damn. Yes. Money. That is money. It's exactly what we're talking about here. The cumulative spending since Nixon started the war on drugs in 1971, $1 trillion. Now, you're asking, okay, what's the alternative? You're telling us all the bad things that have happened thanks to the war on drugs. You told us that it's inefficient, that it's ineffective. What's the alternative? Well, let's look at other first world nations. Let's look at Europe. In Portugal, one of the most studied cases, Portugal decriminalized all drugs for personal use in the year 2001, 25 years ago, and shifted from criminal punishment to a public health approach involving dissuasion commissions that refer people to treatment and services rather than jail. So what was the effects? I bet Portugal is one of the most violent, dangerous, horrific countries in the world. Well, you'd be wrong if you believe that. There were significant reductions in overdose deaths and drug-related harms, often reported well beneath European averages. There were lower rates of new HIV infections amongst people who inject drugs. There was increased engagement in treatment and harm reduction services. There was reduced incarceration for possession and criminal justice costs, freeing the police to target supply. No evidence of major increases in drug prices that would spur greater use. So there it is. Many European countries, including parts of the Netherlands, Czechia, Switzerland, Belgium, have reduced criminal penalties for drug possession and prioritized health-oriented responses. And generally speaking, they have lower rates of arrest and incarceration for drug possession. They have stable or lower levels of drug use compared to countries with punitive systems. European use rates often resemble those in the U.S. despite more liberal laws. So again, the war on drugs has not stopped anybody from using drugs who wants to use drugs in America. And let me just say this. I'm not saying this because I want to use drugs. I don't use drugs. I have never used drugs. I do not drink alcohol. I am a complete teetotaler. Okay? I don't even drink beer. So this is not about me. If you made drugs legal tomorrow, I wouldn't buy any anyway. Just like alcohol, like there's a liquor store right down the street here on 5th Avenue. I've never been in it. Have no reason to. I'm just saying. I'm speaking solely about what I've seen destroy the lives of so many people in not just America, but specifically Gary, Indiana, East Chicago, Indiana, Hammond, Indiana. We have so many people in our communities and our families who've been in jail, who've died thanks to the war on drugs. Aren't you tired? And so you do have some places within America and in this part of the world where cannabis has been decriminalized or legalized, like Uruguay, Canada, and U.S. states like Colorado. There are obviously fewer cannabis arrests and law enforcement costs, so you're saving law enforcement money. There are mixed effects on usage rates, with some groups seeing slight increases and other stable trends. But these policies are not the same as decriminalizing all drugs and have different risk-harm profiles. Now, there have been experiments in this country with broad drug decriminalization. In Oregon, the state of Oregon, they had Measure 110 in the year 2020 that decriminalized possession of small amounts of all illicit drugs and tied a fine to a hotline referral. Obviously, arrests for possessions dropped significantly, but we didn't go all the way. We didn't increase access to treatment services, and there was a low use of the hotline. There were no signs of clear reduction and possible increases in overdoses, deaths during the implementation. Although the impact of fentanyl could have been behind that. So the state eventually reversed this policy amid public safety concerns. Again, they half-assed it. They didn't do like Portugal did it, or places like Switzerland or the Netherlands. They didn't go full with it and treat it as a medical issue. You have to treat it as a medical issue. In British Columbia, they conducted a pilot decriminalization program for select drugs, but recently chose not to extend it, citing limited success and a shift towards comprehensive care strategy. These experiences show that implementation support, which is treatment, harm reduction, and housing, matters greatly to these outcomes. You can't half-ass it, folks. But what you see overall from decriminalization, you see fewer arrests, reduced legal stigma for drug users. You see lower incarceration rates for low-level possession. You see resource shifting from prison towards treatment and health services, but they have to be funded. And you see reduced infectious disease transmission when paired with harm reduction, things like HIV and hepatitis. And so that it is important to understand that drug decriminalization is not a one-size-fits policy. Its effects can vary depending on how broad the policy is, how well treatment, harm reduction, and social supports are funded, the local supply, the local drug supply and overdose context, and you have to have complementary health strategies. Countries that pair decriminalization with strong health-centered systems tend to show better outcomes than those that do not. And the more I learn about this, the more I understand that the powers that be in this country that make lots of money from mass incarceration that make lots of money from maintaining a permanent underclass of people who are living in desperate conditions. They don't want to end the war on drugs. The goal was to never end drug usage in America. The goal was to destabilize poor and black communities. But you know, with this knowledge, with the wisdom I just imparted on you, you can understand what's going on. Hopefully you can go to some of your public officials and actually demand that they make some changes, or at least fight for changes to the system that we have here. All right, folks, it is 7:10. Oh my God, this time's going by fast. So you know what that means? It's time. It's time for some happies. We'll be right back after these. Come back, Janet. Where did you go?